Welcome back to another edition of the Derek Evans Show. We talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. What is inflation? In this segment, I want to talk about something that is really the topic of many news channels in the media, and which is typical really of this current environment, particularly in America, but mainly throughout many of the countries of the Western world, where topics that are very important and really that have a very significant impact on your life, your money, your health, your state of well-being, what you can expect, your expectation, your state of mental well-being as well, your sense of balance. Obviously, if you are less fearful of the future, you have a better state of mental well-being. And of course, if you're faced with a significant degree of inflation, there's a concern about the impact that it'll have on your money, on your savings, on your job, on your wages, on your ability to really enjoy a certain quality of life. Now, these are very important concepts, very important to think about, but unfortunately in many social settings, particularly in America, people don't talk about it. And the example of that is the fact that right now on many news media channels and on many other sources of information, that's what people are talking about. They're talking about the state of inflation. But really, and from a practical standpoint, the factors that contribute to inflation have been in place and really ongoing for many months, perhaps for many years. And instead of really looking at that issue and addressing and taking corrective action to establish a certain level of propriety, balance, both financial, emotional, physical, cultural, sense of well-being, people generally did not even consider inflation, didn't talk about inflation too much until now, until there really is very little that can be done about it of any practical sense without taking some extreme measures in another area and then causing other very significant problems. And we saw this to a very great degree during the responses to the current health crisis, the current health challenge that many people have faced and continue to face. The reaction to that health crisis on the part of many cultures and many environments, and in fact many people and families, many educational systems, has been quite extreme and has caused other considerations and other consequences that unfortunately people are really just becoming to realize the full nature of and the full effect of. And that is a very important concept, and I wanted to talk about that in this segment of the show. Number one, because a lot of people are talking about inflation, but number two, because they only talk about inflation from the perspective of one aspect. And that really characterizes and highlights the advantage of the Shinsei method, what I often call the Shinsei advantage or the Shinsei difference. Because on this show, at theshinseimethod.com, at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel, and really from the perspective of the Shinsei method as a method of training, self-training, self-analysis, self-development, that is the key. That is the focus that I take, to go behind the concept, to go behind the platitude, to get toward the meaning and the understanding about some of the key terms that you use in your finances, your business, and your everyday life, your relationships, your work life, etc. And most people, when they're talking about things like inflation, they only think about it in terms of money terms, which is very important. But the idea of inflation has many different meanings. Now, if you look at, I looked at, before I started this segment of the show, I looked at a dictionary in business financial terms, Barron's, if you want to know the name of it, a Barron's Business Dictionary. And I looked up inflation, and it really highlighted the fact that inflation, the financial inflation, is when there's an increase in the prices of goods and services. Okay, we understand that when prices go up, it has or indicates a certain degree of inflation. Now, the causes of inflation are well understood, but unfortunately, most of the time when people talk about inflation, they only talk about the superficial aspects of it, just prices. Well, just the increase of prices in and of themselves do not necessarily create inflation. Inflation is an increase in prices But the inflation generally is caused by an increase in the money supply. Now, I don't want to turn this into a channel where we talk about economic terms because I'm not an economist. I do study economy and the economy, and I do study economics because I have a personal interest in it, particularly mathematical economics, because I have an interest in mathematics. But I'm not an economist by trade. I just really approach it from a practical, everyday standpoint. And if you think about inflation from a practical standpoint, if prices go up in one area, then that will increase or decrease the demand in that area. If you understand something about how demand and supply work, when the prices increase, let's say there's a decrease in supply, which would tend to increase prices, that will also tend to decrease the quantity demanded in that area. So if you have the aggregate effect of an increase in price in one area is not going to increase prices in all areas, because people will adjust their demand in that area in particular, and they may decrease and probably will decrease their quantity demanded in other areas. In other words, they'll buy less because you only have a fixed amount of income. So if prices go up in one area, then you may decrease your quantity demanded in that area. And depending on what that area is, if it's food and you need food, it's essential, then you decrease your quantity demand in other areas. In other words, if you tend to eat out more, maybe you'll tend to eat out less. The net effect or the aggregate effect of all of that throughout the economy is not necessarily going to increase all prices. Now that is something that is never discussed in many news channels. Some people discuss it, some people who are more honest about what's going on that will discuss these things do talk about it, but in most of the major news networks they don't talk about it at all. And unfortunately, when they talk about inflation, they don't talk about the other aspects of inflation. The inflation in terms of a mindset. Because inflation is not just an increase in prices. You can inflate a balloon. You can become inflated yourself by overeating. This concept of inflation really has a lot of different aspects. And it has a direct bearing on what I talk about and on the Shinsei method, because it's about principle and it's about mindset. Because one of the things that is significant when you have a degree of inflation is a mindset. So for example, what I just described was a rational account of what people would normally do in a rational situation in terms of what happens when the prices go up. Prices go up in one area. You don't want to overspend. Now that is an assumption that I make when I made that determination, that people don't want to overspend, so they'll decrease the quantity that they would demand in the area where the prices go up. And they, depending on where the prices do go up, if they can't decrease it that much, I mean, you can eat a little bit less, but there's only so much you can do, unless you're talking about going out to eat. But that's not really quite the same. When I talk about food prices, I'm not talking about prepared food. I'm talking about the food that you buy in the supermarket. And to some degree, you can't cut that out. You can pare it down somewhat, but there's going to be a limitation to what you can do. Well, if you can't do much about decreasing the quantity demanded of food, then you'll have to look at some other area to cut costs, cut how you spend. But that assumes that the person that is making those choices is rational. Well, what I've found is that that's not always a very reasonable assumption to make, because I have noticed this where I currently live, for example. Gas prices have gone up significantly. But when I look around at the people that live around me at the moment, they haven't changed in their driving patterns. They still are in and out all day long. They still are coming and going as if nothing has changed. Now, clearly they have to pay the same gas prices that I have to pay. Now, when the gas prices go up, from my perspective, I start thinking about ways that I can travel or I can drive less because it's more expensive. That's a rational approach. It's a sensible approach. So I will think about, for example, riding a bike more, walking more, taking the bus. So now I do all of those things as it is, but I will look at ways that I can increase it if I can. I don't drive that much as it is for very personal reasons, but really you start to make these very conscious decisions. If you can work at home more frequently, you might look at doing those kinds of things. But that's a very rational approach. I'm not seeing that in my environment. I'm not seeing that people are taking that approach to inflation by paring down what they're doing. What I'm seeing is the inflation in terms of a mindset increasing, not just in terms of prices, but in terms of how people spend, and in terms of how people borrow, and in terms of how they live their lifestyles, what they're doing, how many clothes they're buying, what kind of lifestyle they're living. Are they coming and going more frequently or less frequently? If you're going out too much, going in and out all hours of the day and night, which I've seen and many people doing, very disturbing. But they're not changing any of that. They're not staying in more, because if you have to go out and drive more, it costs more. That doesn't seem to affect them at all. They just continue to do the same things. And I often wonder, how do they do that? How are they able to do this and maintain that kind of lifestyle? When I see prices go up, it affects everyone. If gas prices are going up, the people that I'm talking about in particular are not particularly wealthy. So the amount of money that they spend on gas and food is a very large percentage of their income. So they are the hardest hit for price increases in gas and food than, let's say, more wealthy people might be. Yet the more wealthy people will look at it in more rational terms in many ways, by looking at ways in how they can spend less, go out less, drive less. Maybe they may decide to try to use electricity a little bit more, or use solar power a little bit more, or do things that are going to have a financial benefit to them in the long run. Well, that's a very rational approach. That's a very sensible approach. And that, as far as the Shinsei method is concerned, is the complete opposite of this inflated mentality. And that's what I wanted to highlight in this segment of the show. When I talk about what is inflation, it's important to understand inflation in terms of financial terms. But it's also important to understand what is inflation in terms of your mentality and your mindset. What kind of mindset do you have? Is your mindset, is it oriented toward inflation? In other words, you do too much, you eat too much, you spend too much, you do too many things that do not contribute to a sense of propriety, a sense of well-being, a sense of balance, a sense of integrity. All of the things that I talk about on this show and at theshinseimethod.com, the principles that are important for building up those 3 pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability: inner strength, inner balance, self-trust. Those principles are important because they contribute to a certain type of mindset. Now, why is that important? That's important because I started out this show talking about, I don't see a lot of people changing their lifestyle and their behavior patterns to accommodate the fact that there's an increase in prices. In other words, spending less, going out less, driving less if possible, those kinds of things. I see them doing the same things that they were doing before the prices went up, as if there's been no effect. And I wanted to highlight in this segment of the show, because that is the crux of the matter for the Shinsei method. Because I developed the Shinsei method to be a method of self-training, to develop what I call the 3 pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability: inner strength, inner balance, self-trust. And I did that because very often I found that if you're an individual that is oriented toward rationality, toward those fundamental principles like balance, propriety, limiting your spending, living within your means, spending less, savings, and investing, taking that long-term approach, you are very often at odds with what is popular in the current cultural climate. In other words, there's a lot of social pressure on you not to gravitate toward or pursue rational and constructive principles. And so I found that it's very important to have those 3 pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability, so that you would be able to strive toward those fundamental principles, particularly at times like this, where everybody's talking about inflation, but nobody talks about it. What inflation, or no one that I've heard talks about what inflation means in an everyday matter, and what inflation means in terms of your mindset, and in terms of how you alter what you do, how you change your approach to what you're doing, what it means in practical terms, how it happened, so that maybe you can do your part to ensure it doesn't happen again, or to be more prepared into the future. This is never discussed. People talk about inflation at this time from the financial perspective. They certainly don't talk about it in terms of your mindset, your mentality, and how inflation is a it means something in a much broader sense. Never talk about that part of it. But even from the financial perspective, when people are talking about inflation, they never talk about how it impacts your everyday life and really what you can do to prepare for it now and into the future. They talk about it rather as if it just fell from the sky, as if this couldn't be predicted to some degree, as if this wasn't expected given the kind of spending that has been going on in the past few years, the enormous amount of spending that's been going on, and the lack of productivity that's been going on because many businesses were shut down for a couple of years, and many businesses are still shut down. There was a severe unemployment for a long period of time, and yet people were continuing to spend because there was an influx of money into the economy during that time. So over the past couple of years, this could really have been predicted, and many of the people who contributed to this situation knew this, but they didn't talk about it in terms of how to prepare for it. So this is one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method, because I found it to be very frustrating personally, to be a person that believed in self-preparedness, to be a person who believed in understanding, to get the facts, to get the principles, so that I can be better prepared in my own life. And then every time that I tried to implement that strategy in everything that I did, in family and work, in social settings, I was always discouraged. People don't do it. You can get discouraged in many different ways, from the fact that people don't take any interest in what you're doing, they don't contribute to it, they don't participate in it, to the fact that they take a more direct discouragement toward what you're doing. They laugh at it. They sometimes even become hostile at what you're doing, even though what you're doing has no effect on what they're doing. I've seen that a lot too. You can say that you want to implement certain things in your own life and people get angry at you. I understand it intellectually, but I don't understand it from the perspective of a rationality, from the perspective of reason. I mean, I can understand it intellectually because people, when they become angry at you for doing something that doesn't affect them, typically it's because they are angry at themselves. They recognize that what you're doing makes sense. They probably say to themselves, I should be doing that. And they're angry at you, in quotes, because they're really angry at themselves and what they're doing and their own mentality. They're angry at you for showing that. Now, this is the kind of thing that happens in many social settings. You'll never hear anyone talking about it. I've never heard anyone talking about it. I have really gone to many school. I went to graduate school. I spent many times and many hours in college and in many other kinds of training programs and work and in other kinds of personal self-enrichment courses. I have never heard anyone describe those kind of effects. The only person that I have found that came close to describing those kind of really ridiculous things that go on in many social settings was Ayn Rand. And she often talked about these kind of irrationalities that go on from a philosophical perspective. And she was very accurate about that. She wrote a lot of different books on just that. That she used to describe it as the hatred of the good for being good. Well, I described it from a slightly different angle, more of a psychological angle. I'm not a psychologist, but I do understand something about how people operate because I've had to. I've looked at over a period of many decades. I've had to learn about a lot of these topics in psychology and self-development because I wanted to develop myself, and I didn't have a lot of direction. I didn't have a lot of guidance, even though I sought it out, not from parents, not from other people in positions, not from trainers, other people in positions of authority, not from trainers, what have you, teachers, professionals. I have never found anyone that described these things, but I've noticed it. I've seen people doing it. I've been married to people that do that. You say something that doesn't affect them in any sense, and they get angry at you. I never understood that until I started thinking about why they do that. It's a defensive mechanism is really what it boils down to. But in reality, when you're living your life, it really doesn't make a lot of difference, I have found, why people do these kinds of things. Just the fact that they're doing it creates an obstacle for you in many work settings, in many living settings, in many family settings, in many educational settings. And for me, It was always a matter of survival. What kind of mentality and philosophy and perspective can I develop so that I can deal with these matters? And I've had a long, difficult road of doing that, because ultimately what happens in the beginning is you start to doubt yourself. If not everyone is doing that, and people are becoming angry with you in many social settings, most people aren't taking that approach. It's very easy for you to say, well, maybe you have the wrong approach. Well, do you have the wrong approach? What is wrong to you? What is an objective standard that you can use to evaluate what you're doing from a very practical standpoint? Again, to me, that was one of the great values of Ayn Rand, because she often talked about, in fact, she developed what she called objectivism. And it was based upon this objective approach to reality, finding some kind of objective standard to measure what you're doing, rather than just accepting what other people are saying. Because you can accept what other people are saying if what they're saying is constructive and rational. But very often it's not. Very often it's very destructive, and it's very subtle for you to recognize that it's that way, because very often it depends on your living situation, your ability to earn a living. If, for example, pursuing a rational course of action gets you fired, that's a pretty strong social pressure on you not to pursue that rational action. And it becomes very easy for you then to doubt that pursuit of reason and rationality. And that's what I did. I'm speaking from personal experience. Then you start to doubt your values, you start to doubt your inner thinking, you start to doubt yourself, and that leads to things like depression. And I'm speaking from experience. Not because I'm a psychologist, I'm not, and I'm not offering psychological therapy, I don't, but I've experienced it, I've lived through it, and I know how this process works. And it's only coming back from that process, that spending all of those years trying to figure that out, that I came to the realization that you really do need a certain level of self-trust to begin with. Because when you start to embark on a path that is rational, and it may not be common, you'll get a lot of resistance. And you'll need in your life to figure out a strategy for how to deal with that resistance in a very practical manner. In other words, you'll have to be able to adopt a strategy that works in your work setting if you're working for someone else. If you're working for yourself, you'll have to determine what kind of product and service you can offer that's going to be individually suitable to you, given the way that the reality is and the way the society is and the current trends are. When I'm talking about the current trends, I'm talking about this idea of inflation. Well, if you're trying to run your business in a way that's preparing you for this inevitable inflation that you're expecting and no one else is doing it, it becomes very difficult to develop colleagues, for example. People don't want to talk to you. People don't want to associate with you. How do you deal with that? One of the ways that I found from a very practical standpoint is to really keep a lot of that from within. To train yourself and teach yourself not to doubt rational values, but really to be very careful and circumspect where you share those rational values, and adopt a survival mentality for yourself so that you can earn a living. Because ultimately, you do have to earn a living. You do have to buy those food and gas products and services, even though the prices may be high. You still have to find some way to pay for it, like everyone else. So unless you're going to approach it like a lot of other people do, in other words, trying to find the unearned, seeking the unearned, of course, we don't talk about that on this show, and I certainly don't advocate that. I'm talking about doing things that you earn, then of course you'll have to come up with some kind of rational strategy. And again, developing a rational strategy then comes back to, as I see it, particularly in the current climate, the current cultural climate, specifically in America and in many of the Western countries, it comes back to that level of self-trust. And of course, self-trust is directly tied to inner strength and inner balance. So to me, that really becomes the mission in life and work and business and family and education, developing those three pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability. Inner strength, inner balance, and self-trust for yourself. Because ultimately, when you start to develop your own way of looking at things and your own level of independence, you'll have to have some rock of Gibraltar to fall back on, some compass, some waypoint, some reference that you can say to yourself, this is the North Star that directs me, and it makes sense for me. May not make sense for other people. I can't speak for other people, but it makes sense for me. And I'm going to stick with this because I have seen that it produces more desirable results than not. It's much more profitable to me than not. And it just makes much more sense to me than not. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.